Would you we stand in awe of you. Praise God from whom blessings flow. Praise Him, all creatures here below. Praise Him above you, heavenly hosts. Praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. God we praise you. God we praise you.
Amen. Lift up praises. On the cross, because you created the people that you created, put you there. And what you're dealing with that you're doing in the world, doing in us, in your church. And we praise you for all that you've done for us. From the start to the end, if you can even call it that creation. Yeah, we just praise you. And we seek to bring a greater knowledge of who you are tonight. Lord, would you bring that fruition, Lord? Amen. So, have a seat, folks.
I just want to invite you to all give Mr. Robichaud a warm welcome. Good evening, everyone. It's so nice to see you all. And I want to start by thanking Adrian for the invitation to come and speak with you today, and to thank him also for the amazing work that he's doing through this. Now, I see a lot of familiar faces, but I also see a lot of faces that I don't know, and perhaps that even some of you who don't know me might actually know me indirectly. So, my wife and I have 3 kids. They're all adult children. 2 of them are married, and one of them is Patrick, and you might see him sometime in the back booth. He's the one who's 6'7". He's not here tonight, but 6'7", so he's my little boy. He's married to Jay Shell, and they have a little baby girl called Jasmine. So I'm a grandfather now, so that's a new life. And I have another son, Justin, that you might have seen also. He's the short one. He's only 6'4". And my baby girl, Emma, who's married to Will Heron. And so you might have seen her. She's now part of the Heron family. Yeah. So that's a little bit about my personal background. Academically speaking, I did my undergraduate studies in biochemistry, so that's my bread and butter. Then I did my graduate research in organic chemistry, so the total synthesis of naturally active compounds. And then I worked in medical research for 12 years, and after that I transitioned into teaching. So for the last 12, 13 years, I've now been teaching at the CEGEP level, and for the last 3 years, I was head of the chemistry department at Champlain. So that's a little bit about my background. I do not come from a Bible-believing family. That is not my story. That is not my background. In fact, when I was in university studying biochemistry, I was becoming more and more of an agnostic and an atheist. And during those years, a friend of mine challenged me to examine for myself the evidence, and so that's what started my journey. And so at that point, I started examining some of the things that we're going to be talking about tonight. Let me just put this on full screen. And essentially, I came to a point where I became convinced, overwhelmed by the evidence that there has to be a God, there has to be a creator. And eventually, down the road, as I continued to search into these important questions, then I eventually became a Christian. So that's a little bit of my story. I could speak a lot more about that, but that's going to suffice to get us in the subject tonight. I'm not here to tell you what you should or you shouldn't believe. That is not at all the goal. The goal, in fact, proper science is about critical thinking. But the problem is you can only do critical thinking if you have something to critically think about. And what's happening in the world today is we're only hearing one side of the story. And that prevents people from making informed decisions. So my purpose is to essentially share information that everyone should be aware of so that they can make an informed decision. Okay? So that's the perspective and the purpose of what we're going to be doing tonight. And I've been doing this talk for almost 25 years in various different formats. So this has been given hundreds of times in different contexts. Very often not in a church context. So I also speak in places where it's atheistic and agnostic background. So I can also share a little bit about that later on. And I would say that generally speaking, while there's no way to prove that there is a God, you cannot prove empirically that there is a God. When you examine the quality and the quantity of the evidence that's available to us, it points in that direction in a very strong way, to the point where sort of like when you're dealing with a court case setting, beyond a reasonable doubt. And so that's essentially my perspective, which, again, you'll have a chance to look at the evidence tonight and discuss it. So hopefully we'll have a chance to have question and answers at the end and engage in this together. So I'm going to start with something a little bit fun, which is a little illustration of evolution. And this was essentially published not long after the theory of evolution was formulated. And it summarizes the whole perspective in a very interesting way. And it starts like this, from these 5 letters, CHAOS. Out of chaos came something. We don't know exactly what, we don't know exactly when, but that's the notion that is being brought to us, that life came out of chaos. And through this interesting cycle, that it eventually led through this very interesting barbarian to this nice, refined British gentleman. And so that's the theory of how life would have arisen and how and why we're here where we are today. And of course, you see the image of Charles Darwin himself. It is important to remember that the theory of evolution existed before Darwin, but he's the one who sort of structured and formalized it in a way that was more scientific than what existed before. It is a serious theory that needs to be taken seriously. And so this is, again, what you're going to see me, hopefully, try to do tonight. The other important thing to notice is in the background, there's a clock. And that represents, of course, time. And that's the question that we must all answer for ourselves. Can matter and energy plus time allow everything that's here? This is the question of our origins. And how we answer that question is fundamental in understanding who we are, what is our purpose, and also eventually into what is our destiny. And before we get going into this tonight, I do want to define the term evolution. The term evolution is a very chameleon word. It can mean many different things. And the way that I'm going to use evolution tonight means 2 things. I'm not talking about small changes and variations that take place in life. That is not what I'm talking about. When I talk about evolution, I talk about bridging that gap between inanimate matter and animate matter, and then bridging that gap between all of the different kinds of life that exist that would eventually lead to us. So remember that as I use these expressions. This goes back now to a textbook of mine. This is Leninger, Principles of Biochemistry. And on the very first pages, here's what it says about the beginning of all things. That some 20 billion years ago, the universe arose with an explosion, and every atom was born in the Big Bang. If you're going to talk about life and evolution, you have to have something from which life can arrive. You need a universe. So where does the universe come from? And that's essentially the answer that is typically given, and this is the answer that I grew up with. But as we're going to see tonight, while this seems to provide an answer, it actually brings more question than answers. And this, again, points to 3 different paradoxes, okay? 3 great mysteries. And here's the thing. Very often people think this is science against faith. But when you boil it down to the basics, it's one kind of faith against another kind of faith, okay? One being veiled in so-called scientific language. And the first mystery is, whether you believe in God or you don't believe in God, we are all facing a great mystery, which is, how did the universe begin in the beginning, right? So from a theist perspective, from a biblical perspective, we'll say, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And none of us were there. You have to take that by faith, right? And so if you are not going to believe that, then you have to believe something like this, where, again, nobody was there. So where does this quantum dot or quantum fluctuation come from? So as you can see, it's a bit of a mystery either way. And then it says this: living things are composed of lifeless molecules that conform to all the physical and chemical laws. So if living things are composed simply of lifeless molecules according to these laws, where are the laws that essentially lead to life appearing on its own? You see, this is the second mystery, the second paradox that we all face. How can inanimate matter lead to animate matter as we understand it? And the next statement highlights another paradox, the last of those three mysteries that I like to point at. Yet, living organisms possess extraordinary attributes not shown by collections of inanimate molecules. In other words, life displays certain attributes, certain qualities that we don't see in matter. And so if life is simply made from matter, where do these extraordinary attributes come from? And once again, whether you believe in God or you don't believe in God, we are all facing these great mysteries. And the question is, again, what is the foundation of evidence that we stand upon to believe what we believe? What is the quality and the quantity of those evidences? Now I'm going to go way, way back to a time where essentially people recognize that life is found everywhere on earth. And it seems to be everywhere and is able to appear seemingly out of nothing. And for the longest time, people and even scientists believe that life, under the right conditions, could just spring to life. And essentially this continued to be believed until the time of Louis Pasteur, where he essentially did some key experiments, which hopefully you are familiar with, that demonstrated what we now call the genetic laws of life. And there are two basic tenets. First of all, only life can give rise to life, and like will always give rise to like. But again, the theory of evolution proposes that over time, these principles were essentially violated, broken. So what we need from a scientific perspective is to try to find baby steps that would allow life to appear from non-life. Everybody, I'm sure, again, is very familiar with this experiment that was done, the Miller-Urey experiment, where they basically took these gases, methane, ammonia, water, and hydrogen gas, placed it in this apparatus with water, heated it, and refluxed the whole thing with electrical discharges. And lo and behold, when they started analyzing the mixture that was produced in this, they discovered simple amino acids. And that was a eureka moment for a lot of people, and this was published everywhere in the world that we've been able to reproduce life in the laboratory, because of course amino acids are the basic components of proteins. But as we start examining this little experiment, and we've had a lot of time to reflect on this and a lot of extra knowledge that's been accumulated, it starts to point in a very different direction. First of all, in order to get this, someone had to build this, right? In order to get these amino acids, someone had to build this. And those amino acids that were obtained were not only just the simplest one, but they were racemic amino acids. Now, in life, we have a principle that's called chirality. And you can have mixtures of different mirror images, and yet all of life possesses only one of those two mirror images, which is a bit of a mystery. Also, there's one important ingredient that was excluded, and that is oxygen. Now, that's for an obvious reason, because if you put oxygen in there and discharge electricity, well, instead of trying to create life, you would have destroyed life in that lab, okay? So there's an obvious reason. But that's a big challenge again, because we know the importance of oxygen. And besides, all of these gases are toxic to life. Last, but definitely not least, is the fact that these conditions that allow the generations of simple amino acids are actually very, very good, if not better, at destroying sensitive organic molecules. So they had to design this trap mechanism in order to capture some of these molecules. And even then, it was a black tar. And so full of complex, toxic mixtures of compound where very, very few were actually of interest to us. Now, the last thing that I'm going to say on this subject is water. We live in a day and age where, people are looking for water in space, and they think that because they found water in some planet somewhere, maybe there's life, Well, here's the thing. Water has life allowing properties, but water has no life giving properties. We got to remember that. It's sort of like a car, right? If you want to run a car, you need oil. But just because you find oil somewhere, do you expect a car to appear? There's a big difference between the two. And what's even more fascinating, that water is actually a challenge to the appearance of these complex molecules. Because chemistry, thermodynamics, physics demonstrate that DNA, proteins, and fatty acids will actually decompose in the presence of water. So the presence of water, though it is important as a solvent, in fact will destroy these molecules over time. So as you can see, the picture starts to be more and more complex. Now, even if you forget everything that I've just said here, try to remember the following. Imagine taking a walk in the jungle and you see aluminum ore, and you see petroleum oil that's coming out of the ground, and you see trees that are rubber trees, right? You see all of these ingredients. Would you jump to the conclusion that you found the explanation for this? Of course not, right? But here's the thing. Being able to demonstrate that amino acids are going to form spontaneously under the conditions that we've just described is essentially saying, well, because of these things, clearly life can just appear. No. Just as the basic components of the plane are necessary to build the plane, these components in themselves will never just come together spontaneously to build a plane. It requires something more. And as complex as a plane is, a single cell is much, much more. Our bodies are even more. You see what I'm saying? So the more you start to understand these results in the light of the complexity and the reality of life, it starts to paint a very, very different picture. And this is the principle of Polanyi, which says that machines and living systems transcend, go beyond simple material explanations. In other words, you need something more, because just the matter and energy on its own is not enough. Now, typically, because I talk to a lot of people, the thing that is going to be said at this moment is going to be, well, the universe is so great and we have billions and billions of years, right? And so time could allow what seems impossible to us. But we got to be very, very careful here. Time only allows what's possible. Does time allow the impossible? So the question now becomes, how do we know the difference between what's possible and what's not? This is where the debate rages, okay? And so in order to try to answer that question, we need to understand the governing laws. If we're going to talk about probabilities and what probabilities can do over time, we need to understand the fundamental governing laws of the universe. And again, I could spend a lot of time talking about this. I'm only going to look at three important principles. The first one, very obvious, very intuitive, that everything that happens in the universe happens for a reason. All effects have adequate causes. This is the principle of causality. Nothing happens without a reason, okay? The second principle, and this enters now thermodynamics, is that energy converts to a form unable to do work. Now, if you have wood, there's a certain amount of energy in that wood. You burn that wood, did any of the matter disappear? No. But you know that the energy that was contained in that matter has now been dissipated. So has the energy disappeared? No. What has happened is that energy has been transformed from a state in which it could produce work, light and heat, to a state where now it cannot. It's sort of as if the universe is like a battery. It's got a certain amount of potential energy, and as everything is happening around us, that energy is being spent. So here's the next question. What is the driving force behind this reality? What is the driving force that leads to this battery being spent? This brings us to a very important concept. Again, the second law of thermodynamics, which is entropy. And entropy is basically the measure of disorder. And here's the crazy things, guys. Everything that happens in the universe must lead to an increase in the disorder of the universe. Think about that. Everything that happens in the universe must lead to an increase of the disorder of the universe. That's the second law of thermodynamics. You cannot break that, okay? So what does this tell us? Well, essentially, when we look at the universe, right? So that means that energy is going down as a function of time, and the driving force is that disorder is going up. So that means as if you look back in time, we are moving from highest to lowest energy, and we're moving from lowest disorder to highest disorder. So it points to some type of beginning where energy was maximum and disorder was minimum, and we're leading to a place where no life will ever be possible if time just went on. The sun cannot burn forever. The stars cannot burn forever. This is the picture that it paints. And when scientists start looking at this and examining not just the complexity of life, but also of the reality of the universe, we've got some very large, big names, big scientists who are going to say things like this. If you have not heard this quote, you should have. Here's what Albert Einstein says. The laws of the universe manifest a spirit vastly superior to that of man. You need to recognize that many of the great scientists, especially in the past, would study the universe, would study life, and they would say, there has to be something more. We live in a day and age where this is becoming more and more unpopular, and I've been part of that, okay? And you are probably victims of that in some way. But the reality is that there's much reason to look to the reality of a creator. What about life? This is a quote from Paul Davies, which is a scientist who is not atheist, and on the subject of life. Can life appear on its own based on what we're seeing here? He flatly admits that there is nothing in the known laws to compel, to make matter organize into life. And again, even a great name such as Charles Darwin himself, again, if you don't know this quote, you should know it, at the end of his book, he basically says at the very end, life descended from one primordial form into which life was first breathed. And he actually uses the word creator in another part of what he writes. So what I'm saying is here that there's a lot of reason to believe that there has to be something more. Now, step back. What's the common argument against this? Because I'm talking about the second law of thermodynamics. The argument is the second law of thermodynamics applies to closed systems. And the earth is not a closed system, it is an open system. It is receiving all of this energy from the sun. Aha, that energy could perhaps be doing something interesting. And this quote here, this is from Scientific American, sums it up, saying our planet as a whole can grow more complex. In other words, going up in energy, going down in disorder because the sun is pouring heat and light into it. In other words, the argument that we're using in the previous slide, we're able to push them aside by saying the earth is not a closed system, it's an open system. Well, that's interesting, but we need to, again, take time to analyze this carefully. Now, I worked in the lab for the most part of my life. We're trying to take simple molecules and to make complex molecules that would become drugs, the good kind, okay? And essentially, if somebody came up to me and said, well, you know, instead of just doing all of this hard work, let's just put a bomb in the lab and detonate the bomb, and maybe all of that energy is going to make some super drugs. Like, it's a great idea, right? But do you think it would work? Not at all. In fact, that would bring a tremendous amount of not only disorder, but even those molecules that are in the lab that are relatively complex, under the force of that energy, they're not going to become more complex, they're going to become more simple. So again, we're right back with the fundamental questions. How can life become more complex, and how can energy essentially increase? Well, this is because what we discover in biological systems is the reality of photosynthesis. And essentially, photosynthesis is able to harness that energy that could be and would be destructive, and essentially put it to work and generate these systems that are high energy and high complexity. You know, it's sort of like if you take a car and you want to get somewhere, right? And somebody says, no problem, I'm going to help you out. Takes a can of gasoline, pours it on your car and lights it on fire. Is that going to help? Not at all, right? You're just going to burn it. You're going to destroy the car. So that energy is only useful if you're going to put it in a place where there's a system that is going to be able to capture it and to use it for something good. And that's what we discover in life. So we're right back to the fundamental question, which is, where do these structures come from? Because the cascade of enzymes that exist in order to capture the energy of the light and to transform it into chemical energy such as sugar is absolutely awesome. And I use the word properly now in what God has created. So that brings us to our first conclusion, which is while life structures and mechanisms operate according to physical properties or principles, these do not explain their origin, right? And I'm going to use the example of a computer. A computer does amazing things, right? It's amazing what it can do. But does it use any miracles? Is there anything special? No. But can the same principles by which the computer exists and function, could it generate another kind of computer? No, that requires something more. Now we get to the next subject. And the next subject is now focusing more specifically on life. And Darwin, in his book, has this very interesting challenge that he lays out. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ could not possibly have formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. In other words, he is recognizing that within life there's a certain level of complexity, and natural selection that he proposes is going to eventually lead to higher forms of life, can only select something that is functional. And yet we see in life these structures, like he was fascinated with the eye and seeing all of these different tissues that work together for the function of the eye, and basically saying if there's a precursor that is not functional, that there's a type of complexity there, that it would not be generated, and his theory will be destroyed. Now, this concept of complexity has been more defined, better defined more recently. Behe, this concept has been around for centuries, and Behe defined it this way. He said an irreducibly complex system is composed of several interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, and where the removal of any one of the part causes it to cease functioning. In other words, you got a mouse trap, you want to catch mice, you need the base, you need the spring, you need the thing that is going to hit the mouse, you need the cheese, and you need the detonator, the little thing, right? If any of these things are missing, will you catch the mice? You will not, right? So basically, if there's things in life that are this complex, well, the theory breaks down. So, of course, any precursor would not be functional. So here's what we're going to do in the next slide. We're going to look at not just the eye, but we're going to look at a cell of the eye. Because now we've been able to break apart the cell and understand it in the way that when the theory of evolution was formulated, it was a black box. They didn't understand it. They called the cell a bag filled with protoplasm, right? And it's not their fault. They couldn't see. They didn't understand. But now we're able to understand so much more. Now, you guys are sitting here tonight. You had a good meal. You've got about 60 to 70, not million, not billion, but trillion cells, okay? And essentially, you all started, amazingly, from a single cell, which means that that single cell had to multiply trillions of times in order for you to be here. And all of the genetic information that was inside that first original cell had to be faithfully copied without mistakes, because mistakes lead to mutations, and some mutations can lead to cancer, can lead to death, can lead to all kinds of issues. And so all of this had to be done those times. How many bits of information in a single human cell? Over 3 billion. Okay, that's a lot of information. How's this done? Well, first of all, the DNA is all rolled up, right? You got a double helix DNA. So you need to have special enzymes that are going to unroll, uncoil, open it up, insert into it, and essentially start copying the process. This requires, again, a choreography. It's like an orchestra of all these different proteins that are all absolutely essential in order for this to be done. And lo and behold, there's even another system that will go along and follow and check to make sure that all of this is done properly. If one of the letters that has been introduced, chemical letters, genetic letters, it'll stop. It'll recruit another protein that's going to come, cut it out, excise it. Another one will bring the proper base pair, add it. Another protein comes and stitches it and then says, all right, you can keep going now. Quality control. That's pretty impressive. But that, again, is just DNA. DNA doesn't lead to anything on its own unless that information is expressed into something. And now we have something that's called transcription. So inside the genome, in the center of the cell, you have all of this DNA with all of the different genes. And those genes can only be expressed if you're going to have another kind of machinery that is going to identify where the gene is, where it starts, where it stops, and essentially be able to transform that information in the genome into something that is now going to lead to an action. And that is essentially the last step of the process, which is translation. So you've got another type of machinery the ribosome that is going to walk along the mRNA that brings the information from the DNA, read them 3 letters at a time to make a genetic word. And these words translate for different amino acids. Remember those amino acids? And essentially put them together into a protein. That protein needs to be folded, shaped, added, modified, brought to the right place inside the cell, and then it starts to do its work. All of this has to be done in order for life to be possible. So, which came first? Was it the DNA that was there first? No, the DNA requires all these proteins. Was it the mRNA that was there first? No, the mRNA requires the DNA, and in order to be made, it needs proteins. Was it the proteins first? No, because proteins come from mRNA that comes from DNA. It is a vicious cycle beyond the egg and the chicken. All right? And essentially what we discover is irreducible complexity on steroids. That all of these things need to be present and functional, otherwise a single cell will not work. Now, let's also look at something a little bit more familiar to every one of us. We are not single cells. We are not just one big cell, and we are not just one cell multiplied trillions of times. We have different kinds of cells, even though we all come from one cell. And so we're going to look at life in 6 different ways. The first is going to be control and structure. Now, in order for life to be possible, you need control. You need information that is going to be expressed, that is going to exercise control. And of course, inside the cell, that's the nucleus with the DNA. But for you guys, it's the brain that's inside the head, right? And so this brain essentially requires the use of all of these different organs and systems in the body in order for it to be possible to exist. And yet at the same time, it directs and decides and takes information from all of these in order for it to be possible. And again, in order for information to be useful, it has to be expressed in a tangible medium. And so the structure that we have, unlike the little cell, well, we've got a skeleton. You've got over 200 bones in your body. And you've got over 600 tendons that connect, ligaments that connects those bones. And then you've got muscles, I think I mixed myself up. 600 muscles, over 600 muscles, over 900 ligaments between the bones, and over 4,000 tendons between the muscles and the bones. And again, you need all of this structure there in order for motion and structure to be possible. And some of these, if they're missing, life just doesn't happen. So once again, we see here a picture that is extremely complex. We're very proud about what we do with our computers that mimic the brain. We're very proud about our cars and planes and space shuttle that mimic some of the structure and the use of energy in order to do motion. But all of these things that we have done are nothing compared to a cell, not even less to a body. Who would dare say that this can appear on its own, or this can appear on its own? But a cell has appeared on its own. We've appeared on our own. Is that reasonable? Is that the answer, the truth about who we are and where we come from? That's a question that you have to answer for yourself. Now, in order to live, we are dependent. In other words, we need to take things from our environment in order for us to survive. And this that comes inside of us is going to be processed and is going to be released in a form that's different from the way that it entered our body. Now, a single cell is able to take what it needs from the environment directly. But for you and me, it doesn't work, right? It's like the soup that you're eating right now. If you place it in your hand, are you going to be fed? Are the cells on the top of your hand be fed? No. You see what's happening? So higher levels of complexity require higher levels of organization once again. And so you've got physical degradation of the food. You've got chemical degradation of the food. You've got biochemical absorption and transport of that nutrient in order for life to be possible. Once again, you see something that is much more complex. And if some of these steps are not working, are you going to be able to live? No. You see, some of these are absolutely critical. Now, we think that we've got body odor issues, okay? The cell just oozes out all of its waste. Good thing that we don't function the same way, right? That would not be good. But essentially what we see is that, again, in higher levels of complexity, there's other mechanisms that are going to essentially capture the waste and store it and keep it until the right moment to get rid of it, right? So again, we see other levels of complexity, and all of these systems there that are basically removing the waste, if they fail, can we keep living? Absolutely not. So once again, whether it's intake or it's processing and outtake, this is all absolutely essential. Now we get to our last 2 points on the subject of higher organisms. We started with the cell, and now we go to higher organisms. We talked about in the beginning how DNA can be fixed. And what we see is that the body also is able to fix itself. You know, you get a cut, you're not going to bleed to death unless you're a hemophiliac, which, by the way, is because you've got a mutation. And so here we see this is the fibrinogen web that essentially captures all of those red blood cells so that you're not going to bleed to death. And then the tissues are able to start fixing themselves. And here we've got a picture of a lymphocyte T lymphocyte that is about to eat up a little bacteria. Bye-bye bacteria. So the point is, again, that in the reality of our bodies, unless you have a defense system that is highly efficient and operational, life, once again, is not possible. Either you've got these systems in place and you can live, or you do not and you die. It's as simple as that. Now, I think everyone here knows that you're not going to reach a point in your life where you're going to start splitting in the middle, okay? This is not how it works with higher organisms. It's a little bit more interesting and complex. So think about this. In order for a human being to be born, you need to have a male with all of the plumbing and the biochemistry and the biology that is going to be complementary to a woman that has all, by the way, I didn't use the word identify as, just in case you didn't notice. Just male, female. Okay, we're good. All right. So essentially, the female with all of these things in order for that reality to be possible, for life to be born. And then that mother must have inside her biology everything that is ready for that child to be able to grow and at the right time to be pushed out, which requires a little help from the mom. I remember I had 3, okay? And then to have also all of the milk that is going to be ready for that child to be able to live. And yet we can't forget that that child, the moment that it's born, has to have the reflex to do 2 things. The reflex to breed, otherwise it's dead, and the reflex to drink, otherwise it's dead. So we see, again, every single partner within this that is necessary in order for life to be possible. Stop and think about this for a minute. What we are told about humanity is that men and women have evolved from something somewhere in the past where there was no male and female. Try to imagine that. Even in the literature, there is no way to come up with a scheme where man and woman can arrive on the scene without man and woman being there in the first time. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay? And yet we're being told that unless we believe that, we're ignorant. So this essentially completes the picture, which is to show that life manifests an interdependent, irreducible complexity at every single level. At the level of the biomolecules, at the level of the cell, at the level of the tissue, of the organ, of the system, all over the place. And all of that has to be fully in place and functional in order for life to be possible. This brings us to our second conclusion. Life structures and mechanisms possess a kind of complexity that natural selection cannot gradually build. Next topic. This is one of my favorite ones. In all the classes that I teach at the college for the last 12 years, every single student has heard me say this. Now it's your turn. I love the expression, everything in the universe is and matter and energy. Everything in the universe is matter and energy. And I love that expression because indeed, in this universe, we're able to describe and understand so much just by relying on matter and energy. But here's what I do in my classes. I ask the question, is that actually true? And I give my students an illustration. And I say, imagine I have a supercomputer and I download all of the information of mankind. And then I ask a team of scientists to come into the room. And I say, in terms of matter and energy, analyze everything that can be analyzed, right? The identity, the mass, the size, whatever, right? Then I ask them to leave the room, close the door, and I take a magnet and I go like this on the hard drive. Then I ask the same scientist to come back in the room and I say, do the same analysis for matter and energy and tell me, is anything missing or is anything extra? What's the answer that they give me?
See the same thing if they're just looking at matter and energy.
You got it. You got it. Exactly. But you and I know that something is missing. What is missing? Information. So what is information? Information is neither matter nor energy. Information is the organization of matter using energy. For example, I'm from Shediac, New Brunswick, okay? Love the beach. That's where I grew up. And you're taking a walk on the beach and you see these pebbles and it says, I was here, Joel, 2023, okay? So what did I do? I use energy, and with the energy that I use, I move matter around and I use the code. So I am the transmitter, you are the receiver. Because we share the same code, information becomes meaningful. You see what I'm saying? But here's the challenge. There's a storm. You come back the next day. What happens? It's gone. It doesn't say P.S. and I'll see you next year. No, right? Because the laws of the universe, and this is where it gets super important, the laws of the universe cannot generate information, but they will destroy it. The laws of entropy again. Which begs the question, where does information come from? And since life is built from information, you're just backing up the same mystery at a more fundamental level. The only thing that we know that is able to generate information in this universe is a mind. That's the only thing that can generate information. Now, how does this apply to order? Because often people are going to say, well, we see certain structures that are natural that seem to have order and have a certain amount of information. And that's absolutely true, but there are differences. And so one kind of order is what we would call unspecified, which basically are the result of the material laws. Do you notice the symmetry? That is beautiful, that is there. Basically, there are laws and principles that essentially dictate on matter under those circumstances to order themselves in this pattern. But what is the information content in a snowflake or in a crystal? It's actually extremely low. Why? Because it's based on the laws of the universe, which means it's repetitious. So now I'm going to give you a different kind of order, and this is this kind of order. And I'm going to ask the same question. Is this the product of material laws? Of course not. This is not something that will spontaneously appear. It's not magical. It functions according to the laws of the universe, but the laws of the universe cannot generate this on their own. And again, remember, that is much more simple than a single cell or you and I. And of course, the information content in this is much, much higher. Why? Because it is not repetitious. It is dictated. And so, again, when we look at life, this slide is way too packed with information, which is why I brought these two little posters to basically illustrate a little bit of what we know about the information that essentially drives the reality of the cell and the reality of the body, which begs the question, where does this come from? That brings us to our third conclusion, which basically tells us life structures and mechanisms are coded by information that matter and energy cannot generate. I'm going to put that aside now. I'm going to look at one last aspect, which to me is one of the most important ones to consider. Isaac Asimov said, in man is a 3-pound brain, which as far as we know is the most complex, the most orderly arrangement of matter in the universe. Great, I agree with you. But the question is, can this explain free will? Can this explain intelligence? Can this explain emotion? Can you reduce a human being to just neurons and molecules that are interacting? In Nature, and this of course is the most prestigious scientific journal in the world, this is what they're going to say. But first, let me say one more thing before. When you take a rock and you lift it up and you let it go, does it choose to fall to the ground? Is it thinking about something? Does it say, oh, I love you, ground, I'm going to go down? Right? But if we are only matter and energy, where does our ability to have a will? Because in the universe, there is no freedom, none whatsoever. And so if we say that we have a will and we have a freedom, where does that come from? It goes right back to those extraordinary properties that we read about in Leninger in the beginning. Where does that come from? Okay? So here's what answer, the kind of answer. Oh, wait, this is something else. I was thinking of another quote. Nichols and Newsom, here's what they say. If we are determined by the electrical activity in the brain, what are we to make of our freedom, our moral responsibility? And the answer is, we've got no solution to this problem. Because essentially that would mean that we think we're free, but we're not. We think, but we don't. We think we have emotions, but we don't. We're just obeying laws that we just don't understand. Is that who we are? Is that who you are? You see? These are important questions. Sir John Eccles. Okay, I got to go back a second here. So the next quote, okay? So I gave you Einstein, I gave you Darwin, and now I'm giving you Sir John Eccles. And I found this quote when I was working at Merck. I went to the research library at Merck, and I found this book called The Evolution of the Human Brain. And I spent a lot of time reading this kind of stuff. And I got to the end of the book, and this guy won a Nobel Prize for his research on the human brain. Okay? And I get at the end of the book, and this is what I read. Blew my mind. He said this: since material solutions fail to account for our experience uniqueness, I am constrained, I'm forced to attribute the uniqueness of the self or soul to a spiritual creation. I submit that no other explanation is acceptable. So again, how many kids are being told in school, we've got it all figured out. We know how the universe appeared. We know how life appeared. And if you don't believe that, you're ignorant. I'm sorry. We need to spend a little bit more time educating ourselves from the literature and seeing how not everyone believes that who have big credentials. I stand on the shoulders of giants. Last conclusion. The reality of the mind cannot be generated by matter and energy. So in other words, all of these things are pointing to a reality that is way beyond just matter and energy, which is, of course, what is that reality? If these four conclusions are true, you might say, Joel, you sound good there, but there's a lot of people who are very, very smart, smarter than you, who actually don't agree with this. So how do you deal with that? Well, I'm going to go to literature, and this is the quote that I thought it was. This is the quote in Nature that I want to share with you, and here's the answer that we get. Listen carefully. Even if all the data points to an intelligent designer, like what I'm presenting today, such a hypothesis is excluded from science. So, well, why is it excluded? Because it is not naturalistic. In other words, we have decided, even before we're going to analyze and study the data, that whatever answer we are going to accept has to be in the physical realm. If anyone is going to propose anything beyond the physical realm, it is automatically rejected. It doesn't matter how strong or good the evidence is. You see what's happening? There's a filter, there's a bias that is being applied. And that filter and that bias is good for certain things, right? You don't want to call upon gods for why it's raining, right? But now we're not talking about rain. We're talking about the origin of the universe. We're talking about the origin of life. We're talking about the origin of consciousness. And that brings us to the end of our discussion. And I want you to notice that all that I've talked about tonight is simply science, facts that come from science. And from that, we're able to understand and know certain things, but our ability to know who would have been the one who created all these things is very limited. It's sort of like, let's say you've never seen this picture. I know you know who this is, okay? And I know who made this, but let's say you didn't. And I would ask you the question, what can you tell me about the one who made this? You would be hard-pressed, right? You might say, well, he lived around this time. He had this certain style. He liked women, right? But you would be very limited in knowing who the person is. And so this is what I want to tell you, is that science is extremely useful. It is a powerful tool, but any tool has limitations. And science has a certain amount of power, and it has a certain amount of limitation. And when we come to asking the really important questions, which is, where do we come from? Why are we here? What is my destiny? Science can answer that, right? And that brings us to more important things. Remember the three mysteries that we talked about tonight? The three paradoxes. Well, here's what I find fascinating. In the first page of the Bible, we actually get an answer for all three. What does the Bible say about the mystery of the universe? Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God, who is uncreated, who is eternal, who is not locked into the realm of time, space, and matter. He's the creator of time, space, and matter. And if we try to reduce him to this, we are essentially doing idolatry. He is beyond all of these things. That he is the one who created all things. He is the beginning and end of all these things. What about life? Well, matter and energy didn't give rise to life on its own. We're told immediately after that God is the one who spoke, and then as he spoke, then what he had already created was ordered into what we understand and have awe when we see the complexity and the beauty of life. And that last aspect, which is consciousness, again, in that same first chapter, we're told that God created us in his image. And that's why we are able to have a will, that we are able to think, that we are able to have emotion, that God has breathed into us something that is more than just matter and energy. So those questions that I showed in the beginning, how do you answer it for you? Is life simply the product of time and chance? Is there meaning beyond cells and molecules? Again, these are the really important questions. And I keep going. I'm going to have one last slide. We just read Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created, and God said, and it was. And here's what we discover as we get to the New Testament, John 1:1, right? That in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and all things have been made through him, and yet he came into this world. That the one through whom God created all things essentially entered this world. And all of this is not about you, it's not about me, it's about something more. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. We are in the presence of something very, very great, very awesome, that should bring us to our knees in humility and worship as we consider not just creation, but the one who created. And how he is essentially not just the creator, but he is the redeemer. That the one through whom God created all things, God was pleased through him, through Jesus, to reconcile to himself all things by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. In other words, it's good to be able to recognize that there's a God, that there's a creator, but that's not enough. We need to know God, not just as our creator, but as our Father. In Jesus' name, amen.
Move on to it. I'll get to it.
Anyone else's brain spinning a bit? I think it's good and even healthy for us to be challenged in these ways and just see just how insanely specific and complex and wonderful it is the ways that God has created all things, and it just forces us to rely on him, to rely on faith. Now, if we do have a little bit of time for a couple questions. So if there's anything that anyone here has any questions about, wants a bit more clarity about, you can come and grab this mic and ask Mr. Joel.
This is the best part, by the way. When I give these talks, this is what I look forward to. So feel free to ask any question you want.
I'll project.
Oh, okay, I'll just start off.
Is this on? Yeah, it is. Okay, there we go. What is happening in terms of fancy word, the zeitgeist of the world? Because it's like God created, male and female, and there just seems to be such an attack on like biology. Like, what's the spiritual idea? Like, what's the mindset? Or what are you picking up of like what's happening and how it ties into confusion about a lot of people? Because like it just seems that people are just kind of taking it without critical thinking. They just seem to be saying, "Oh, yeah, I guess a guy could be a girl and a girl could be, I guess."
Yeah.
It's like, what's happening? Like, what is making it so not palpable, but just digestible?
So I'll say two things. Number one, when you're sitting down to do a math exam and you've got a question in front of you that you got to solve, How many ways can you be right? One.
Math exam?
Math exam.
I mean, depends if it's a...
You have to have the correct answer. There's one correct answer, okay?
Yeah.
The answer was one. There's
the other one.
one correct answer.
Yeah, the math that we do, it's kind of weird.
How many ways can you be wrong?
Multiple ways.
Exactly. You could say infinite, right? If you look at a number and you say one number is the correct number, then there's an infinite numbers of being wrong, right? So what happens is knowledge it's a fascinating thing, knowledge. In order to learn, you cannot learn in a vacuum. When you learn something, that knowledge has to be connected to something else. You cannot learn in the vacuum, okay? So what happens is what's happening in our world, we've accumulated so much knowledge, but that knowledge has often been built on things that are improper, that are not true. And so what happens is sort of like the classic story of the foundation. If your foundation is not correct and you start building on that, what's going to happen? It's going to crumble in some way, in some form. So we live in a world that has rejected certain fundamental truths and has basically decided we're not going to go there and we're going to go here. Well, if that's true, then you've opened yourself up to something that is not true. And what happens, it's sort of like, I'm going to use a biblical analogy here. Adam and Eve, well, we just ate a fruit. I mean, seriously, what's the big deal? Fast forward a couple of centuries later, and what does it say? Only evil all the time, right? So basically, we are now in a post-Christian, post-biblical society that has basically decided to, no, we don't believe this, we reject that, and so therefore you're going to believe something else and stand upon that. And that choice is going to take centuries to really show what it is. And this is where we are in our day and our age, is that little by little, like the frog, proverbial frog in the water, it's been getting warmer and warmer, but the frog is still in there. But it's going to die at some point. Now, I sound so negative, I apologize. But essentially, we live in a time and an age which is, I mean, you wouldn't think that it's possible. I spoke to a man that I respect greatly. He's originally from Britain. He came to Canada more or less as a missionary. He's almost 100. And he basically told me this. He said, when I was young, what was right, and what was wrong. Not everyone did what was right. But everyone recognized the difference between right and wrong. And then he said, then came the 60s and the 70s with moral relativism, right? Well, it's not that right and it's not that wrong, right? But as that progression takes place, we are now reaching the point where, and this is his words, what was used to be called right is now called wrong, and what was called wrong is called right. And unfortunately, that's the progression that we are seeing. So I've given you a long answer. Oh, you don't need to clap.
All right.
Got some in the back there.
Is there another question? Oh, yeah. Do you want to come up here and grab the mic or project really loud?
I can do that. I don't like mics.
And we got someone else in the back there that lifted their hand.
So if talking to someone in a more personal setting, how would you try and break the caricature of faith versus science?
Ooh, that's a good question. Yes. So, first of all, what I do, and I'm going to let you know about something that I'm not particularly a fan of. I was invited to give a TED Talk, okay? So if you go on YouTube and you Google my name on YouTube, you will see a TED Talk. And the TED Talk, you're not allowed to speak about God or religion, right? And I was asked at the college where I teach, can you give a talk on the subject of evidence, scientific evidence for a creator? Think about that. And the reason they invited me to do that was because my students who heard my little spiel on information, they would come and see me after class. They would want to engage in discussion. And they went to see the organizers of the TED Talk. And they said, this teacher is telling us stuff we've never heard. We want to hear more. And they invited me to give a talk on that. So what I did is I tried to build bridges. See, here's the interesting thing. From a theist, a non-theist, there's a gap between the two, right? And we need to build a bridge. And that bridge can be built in many different ways. And one of the ways in which you can build that bridge is to recognize, instead of seeing what divides us, find what unites us. Did you notice how I started? I said it's not science against faith, it's this kind of faith. against that kind of faith, right? So I'm building a bridge. And that bridge is essentially going to bring some level of humility if that person is willing to listen. In other words, recognize that, oh, yeah, that's right. What you believe is by faith, but actually what I believe, I didn't realize it, also involves faith, right? And then that brings you the ability to share certain pieces of data, pieces of information that supports why you have that faith. And then that person will start to look and say, oh my goodness, where's my foundation, right? That is a long process. That has to be a process that is filled with love, compassion, understanding, because I do this a lot. And when it does, when people are willing to listen, the data speaks for itself. I got so many stories. I'm just going to give you one, okay? One story. This young lady, one of my Sunday school students, former Sunday school student, he was in university, about 24, 25 years old. And he met this girl, and he shared a little bit about his faith. She was in biology. She mocked him. She laughed at him, okay? And he felt like couldn't answer the science questions. So he told her one day, he said, I'd like you to meet a friend of mine. And she was like, sure, whatever. So she came to my house with him, and she wanted to be entertained. Someone who's a scientist who believes in God, this is going to be fun, okay? And that night, we spoke for a couple hours, and she would laugh, and you're like, But it got her thinking a little bit. A couple weeks later, the guy invited her again. She wasn't laughing so much. She was listening a little bit more. This went on and on and on. I had the privilege of baptizing her, and she's now married to that guy. Okay? That's just one story. I could give you, by God's grace, dozens of those stories. So when we take the time to build that bridge, to show real love, to show respect, and to share the data, it's amazing what can happen. Now I'm going to share you my next slide. This is a backup slide that I use with a little bit trying to answer that question. The next slide is basically what I have tried to come up with as a solid answer why I believe what I believe. Got it? Okay, so here's my answer. I call this a threefold testimony. Bless you. I call this a threefold testimony. And here's the way I describe it, okay? 3 things. Why do I believe what I believe? 3 reasons. Number 1, this outer testimony that is outside of me. And this testimony is everything that I can learn about my world through my physical senses. That's science. And if you notice tonight, we talked first about the laws of the universe. And the laws of the universe, while it explains the mechanism of life, it cannot explain the origin of life. In fact, they go the opposite direction. The train is going east, and evolution needs to go west. You see what I'm saying? It's the opposite. Next was the complexity of life. And finally, I talked about the information inside that complexity that codes life. So this is my first reason why I am convinced that there is a God, there is a creator, there's an outside testimony. But that's not enough. There's also an inside testimony. I call this the inner testimony. And that is my ability to think, to have emotion, to have free will and conscience. Molecules can't do that. Atoms can't do that. So where does that come from? It points to the fact that there's a reality within me that goes beyond just matter and energy. But again, notice what happened tonight. I showed the Mona Lisa. And I said, up to this point, yeah, we've got a lot of data, but who's God? Why am I here? Who created me? Well, you can't answer that, right? So if I stop here, I'm a theist, I'm a deist, right? That's all I am. That's not enough. If God exists and has spoken to us, there has to be an utter testimony. And that's what I call the higher testimony. And that is God has spoken to us throughout history since the beginning, that the moral superiority of everything that he has said and done knocks everything out of the park in terms of different religions. And more importantly, there is a divine fingerprint that demonstrates that this word, the word of God, cannot be the product of just humans who sat down and wrote a book. So there's my answer to your very good question in a couple minutes. You're welcome. Now, the young lady in the back that I know but forgot your name, I apologize. Can you get up? She's carrying a load. Precious load, precious cargo.
I was just wondering, I've seen lots of articles lately about like life on other planets, and you talked a little bit about water and stuff, but I'm just curious what you have to say about them finding, like, even if it's like bacteria or something, like proof of life. Like, what do you have to say about that?
That's a great question. That's a popular question now, okay? So here's what I'll say. Number one, from a scientific perspective, we have to answer the first question, which is, can matter and energy lead to life on its own? Yes or no? Based on my understanding, my knowledge, my experience, it is a flat no. Okay? So, if there is life elsewhere in the universe, it has to be because God placed life there. Got it? Now, the next question is, well, if God placed it, who is God? Right? So, if you go in other religions, well, they'll say what they want to say. But if we go to what the Bible teaches, the Bible basically does not explicitly say, I didn't put life elsewhere. Okay? But it explicitly says, and this is from the Psalms, no, it's from Isaiah, that he did not create the earth for it to be void of life. Okay? It explicitly says, Genesis 1, Genesis 2, the Psalms, and especially that verse in Isaiah, God created the earth for the purpose of putting life. Therefore, the silence that is implicit is that if he explicitly created the earth to put life there, implicitly, it means he did not place life elsewhere. Can I be dogmatic about this? No, but everything points in that direction. Are you satisfied with that answer? Okay. Yes.
I know you touched on this before, kind of with your 3-point testimony, but what made you convinced of the Judeo-Christian God as opposed to all the others?
Yes. So that's a long journey. There's many different steps in my journey. I think the step that really broke me and brought me to Christ was twofold. One was I could not continue to reject the evidence that was there, that it required more faith to reject than to accept, right? So this whole thing of when you look at the life, the person, the character of Christ, and you say, okay, there's three possibilities here. Either he's crazy, right? Or he's deceiving people, or he's actually who he says he is. And for the life of me, as I studied the New Testament, he is not crazy, and he is not a deceiver. And so at one point, I had to bow. He is Lord. He is not liar. He is not lunatic. He is Lord. And that essentially came to an abrupt change one night when I was reading the Gospel of John, where it says, the good shepherd lays his life for his sheep, and sheep are not particularly smart, even though I try to be as smart as I can. I know I'm not that smart. And that essentially, I saw him as the one who loves, who gave life, and who gave his life for his sheep. So that's how my journey began as a Christian. Good?
Any other questions? Yeah.
I think I want more from that one. Of like, what made you choose this religion over, like, not necessarily like what made you choose the Bible over other books?
Okay, so again, my testimony is a long one, so I'll just put a little snippet. When I was in university, as my knowledge of many things started to go up, my marks went down. Because I was reading the Quran, I was reading the Bhagavad Gita and the Rig Veda of the Hindus, the life of Buddha. I was meeting with Muslims, I was meeting with Jews, I was meeting with Christians, and I was basically reading the New Testament and the Old Testament. Now, here's what happened. At the outset, I'm going to be honest, the thing that attracted me most was Islam. And the reason was, it's so simple. One book, one prophet, and here are the 5 pillars of Islam. Do this and you'll be good, hopefully. But as I started comparing more and more all of these different religions and philosophies, here's what happens. And this is an example that I use in many of the talks that I give when I'm speaking to Christians mostly. I say it's almost as if I take you outside and I show you the night sky with all the stars. And I ask you, which of the stars is the brightest one? And for me, it was sort of like, looking at all the religions in the world, what's the most bright point of light, right? And then what happened, and this is, again, a little bit of information to try to answer what you're saying. As I was there, kind of looking for the brightest point of light, then the sun got up. The sun is a star. And the moment that the sun got up, all of the stars disappeared. It's not that they don't exist, but the sun is so strong that everything has vanished. And that was, to me, what the testimony of the Bible, more importantly, Christ himself, was to me. And at one point, I cannot continue to not bow and accept and believe this. I would be a fool. We're good?
What's been the rebuttal or the answer to irreducible complexity from the mainstream science? What's their answer to that?
Yeah. The answer to that is a lot of faith, okay? That potentially, in some way, a certain kind of mechanism could have appeared, could have been selected, etc., 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 etc. It's faith upon faith upon faith upon faith, okay? There is no solid answer, and basically it's a little bit like what they say with lawyers. If you have the facts, argue the facts. If you don't have the facts, scream and shout. Insult the person in front of you. Do what you can, right? And so when you actually start examining the kind of answers, they're not answers. I'm reading a book right now, and it's called not The Stairway to Heaven, but The Stairway to Life. And this is a semi-technical book. So if anyone wants to look at that question and to see how they could try to answer it, that's an excellent book to read, The Stairway to Life. But I warn you, it's semi-technical.
Quick micro question, is that a Christian book or an atheist book?
You know what? Okay, I'm going to tell you the truth. That book was on sale. I looked at it, and I was like, don't know the authors. But this is a good price. And I spend 2 hours each way when I go to work, because I work in Champlain College. So it takes me almost 2 hours using the public transport, and 2 hours. I've been doing that for 12 years. So I got a lot of time to read. So I saw this book, and I was like, never heard of these authors, never heard of this. So I just randomly bought it. And I'm like, man, this is worth its weight in gold. I don't even know if they're Christians. I think they are, but I haven't finished the book yet, so I'm going to have to look up these authors after. So this is fresh from this week. I started this week, this book. And I go through one book a week. Yes, because 10 hours, right? So good? Actually, no, it's not 10 hours. It's 2 times. It's more than that.
There's multiple answers.
Yeah, there you go.
Any more questions? Yeah.
I love what you said about irreducible complexity. I was wondering how you would answer somebody who's wondering about parts we often remove, parts we don't, like appendix, wisdom teeth.
Yes. Vestigial organs. Right. So what's interesting is if you go back in time, they had a list, very long list of vestigial organs. And what has happened is that every single one of these useless organs have essentially now found reason to be. And what's interesting is that it's almost as if, well, if it's not essential, then it's useless. Well, I drive a car, and AC is not useless, but it's not essential, right? So actually, these things that are not essential but useful under certain circumstances are an added argument for design. You see what I'm saying? And what happens is our reflex as humans, and I'm the same, if I don't understand it, it's not important, or it's nothing, right? It's like this whole thing called junk DNA, right? With the realization, now listen to this, this is fascinating, okay? with the realization that the DNA in our cells actually codes for less than 1% of the DNA, you know what they said? Well, obviously, this is just remnant from evolutionary nonsense, right? There's only 1% that actually translates into proteins. So they said more than 90% is junk DNA. Then comes the ENCODE project, where they essentially look at not just what DNA gets transformed into proteins, but what DNA gets transformed into RNA. And that number went from 99% junk to now minimum 80% we know it's active for something. So you see what I'm saying? Our reflex is, I don't understand it, it's useless, it's junk. But we should be in the position now that we realize just the opposite. In fact, one of the things that I've appreciated more than ever in the last year is the reality of RNA. And I'm going to give you an analogy, okay? So if you look at a computer, you only see the screen, okay? But what you see on the screen is very little compared to everything that's going on in the computer, right? And then you've got the hard drive. That's like where all the repository of the information is, right? So the hard drive is like the DNA, and the screen is the protein that you see. What's in between? That's the RNA. And in the computer, this is what we call the microprocessor, the RAM, if I'm not mistaken. Patrick would correct me if he was here right now, okay? So what we are now realizing is that the DNA, there's so much information, and we only see the screen. We only see the proteins. But now we're realizing that there's a whole RNA reality in between the two that we never even realized. So most of the genome is actually being translated as mRNA and all kinds of RNA that are communicating and doing all the work, which we can't even see. DNA is stable. Protein, we can isolate. It's stable. RNA, it disappears like that. But that's where most of the work is being done inside the cell.
Any more questions? Good. All right. In that case, I'm going to invite the worship team to come back up, and we're going to have just an opportunity to, as we've just been wowed and amazed by the amazing complexity of how God has created things, just to turn to God and praise Him for His greatness. And
God of creation, there at the start, before the beginning of time, with no point of reference, you spoke to the dark and fleshed out the wonder of light. And as you speak, 100 billion galaxies are born. In the vapor of your breath, the planets form. If the stars were made to worship, so will I. I can see your heart in star, a signal fire of grace. If creation sings your praises, so will I. Syllable empty or void. For once you have spoken, all nature and science follow the sound of your voice. And as you speak, 100 billion creatures catch your breath, evolving in pursuit of what you said. If it all reveals your nature, so will I. I can see your heart in everything you say. Every painted sky is canvas of your grace. Creation still obeys you, so will I. If the stars were made to worship, so will I. If the mountains bow in reverence, so will I. If the oceans roar your greatness, so will I. For if everything exists to lift you high, so will I. If the wind goes where you send it, so will I. If the rocks cry out in silence, so will I. If the sum of all our praises still falls short, we sing again 100 billion times. God of salvation, you chased down my heart through all of my failure and pride. On a hill you created, the light of the world, abandoned in darkness to die. And as you speak, 100 billion failures disappear. Where you lost your life so I could find it here. You left the grave behind you, so alive. I can see your heart in everything you've done. Heart design in a work of art called love. If you're glad your soul surrenders, so will I.
thank you for this evening. Thank you that we get to come here and just be awestruck and amazed at how great and marvelous you are, Lord. Thank you for, thank you for the amazing fact that we just get to come and worship you. We get to come and sing praises to you, the mighty King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the creator of all, the one who has put all things in place with such amazing attention to detail, Lord. Thank you for how your creation declares your glory. Thank you for how your works point to you. Thank you for the fact that we have the Bible, we have your word that also just points to you, Lord. You've given us so much. Ultimately, you've given us salvation and life in you, life eternal in you. Lord, thank you. I pray that as we go from here, Lord, that we would just keep being amazed, keep giving us, that we would keep noticing little reminders, whether that be the trees around us or an earthworm on the ground or a cat crossing the street, whatever it may be, Lord. Just little reminders, things that we see that just remind us that you are God and you are so good and so loving in how you made things. I pray in your name, Jesus. Amen. Well, we've come to the end of the service, and so now it's the part of the evening that's the after service. Once again, if you'd like to go and pray in a more quiet area, there's the prayer room in the corner over there. If you have some more questions for Joel, he's right here. And if you want to look at the easels that he pointed out earlier with some insane amounts of complexity to continue blowing your mind, those are on either side. Could we just give Joel and the worship team a hand? Thank you guys so much. Thank you guys for leading us in worshiping our God, and thank you, Joel, for helping us just be like flabbergasted and just awestruck at our amazing Lord. Also, if you want some food, there is more food available. There's a lot. So have fun with the rest of the evening and eat some more food.
Mm-hmm.